Welcome to everyone joining us online and on location in Paris. Before we start, here's a list of the organizers of today's seminar. Catherine Marshall from CY Paris University, Nathalie Champroux and Stéphane Porion from the University of Tours, Agnès Alexandre Collier from the University of Burgundy, Agnès Karine Tournier-Sol from the University of Toulon, and myself, Florence Harris from Sorbonne Nouvelle University. We are delighted to have with us today a very distinguished speaker. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly is Professor of Political Theory at the LSE. He is the author and editor of a very long list of publications, which include 16 books, many scholarly articles. His interests range across political theory, philosophy, and the history of thought. He has edited and co-edited various journals. He co-founded Political Studies Review. He has kindly agreed to share with us thoughts and ideas from his most recent publication, Against Post-Liberalism. And the title of his presentation today is Post-Liberalism and the New Conservatism. We live in genuinely novel and interesting times, and there is no better person to explain to us why and where we might be heading next. There will be time for questions afterwards from the floor and also anybody online. So if we're all set, I suggest we start sharing your slides. Here we go, so perhaps using the manual way. Can you see us for those connecting?
We can see the slides.
And can you see Professor Kelly?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
You have to make a choice.
We'd like both. Okay.
Okay. You take your seat. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to Laurence and colleagues for the invitation to speak to you today. What I'm going to talk about is my new book, which is so new it's not out, but it's done, so it does exist, okay? And hopefully it will appear next year. I certainly don't think it will have gone out of fashion. So some of the talk will run through the structure of my account of post-liberalism, but I thought it's useful, given the broader remit of this seminar series, to sort of link this also to a question about the nature of conservatism and the future of liberalism. And I will say something that links those two things together at the end. The book is supposed to be critical of, well, it is critical of post-liberalism, but it's critical, hopefully, in a way that takes seriously the post-liberal challenge as a theoretical challenge rather than just as a summation or aggregation of commentators and critics. As I was saying to Laurence before we started, it was something I started to think about quite a long time ago. Seems quite a long, about 2 years ago. When post-liberalism was something that political theorists were starting to talk about, but it was very niche. It was very much sort of on the edge of major debates. Well, that changed on November the 5th. So on November the 5th, with the re-election of President Trump, or certainly as the next president, post-liberalism has come to be only a heartbeat or a breath away from the center of power in the most iconic liberal state, the United States, where the Constitution and sadly its politics is normative for much of the liberal democratic world. At its best, it's always presented as a kind of liberal utopia or a model for a liberal utopia. And many of the most significant late 20th century liberal theorists and their critics build much of their argument around a reading or interpretation of that constitution. Well, now it's in the hands certainly of President Trump, but perhaps more for our purposes, and this is why I say just a heartbeat away or a breath away, because of J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect. Vance, junior senator from Ohio, is a very popular author, wrote a notable book, very well-selling book called Hillbilly Elegy. And he is associated with a group of important post-liberal thinkers in the US. I will talk about some of those towards the third part of my analysis. But he's also very much associated with thinkers who are around Viktor Orban and sort of rethinking of conservatism in the context of Hungary, a place that surprisingly has sufficient money to attract many of the theorists who influence Vance to Budapest. Vance is also one of those who attracts the attention of what are called Silicon Valley tech bros, people like Peter Thiel, very significant and wealthy figures, some of whom argue that liberal democracy has had its day and therefore needs to be replaced. So that's the broader context. What I'm going to talk about is the origins of post-liberalism, then its three core elements, say something about, I've put it here as what is to be done, but the way in which post-liberalism seeks to advance its political agenda, and then, as I say, conclude, I'll probably say something about the post-liberalism and the future of liberalism first, and then turn to post-liberalism and conservatism, but I'll end up with its impact and significance for both of those political ideologies or way of thinking about politics. So let me start with a quote. In 2018, Patrick Deneen published a book called Why Liberalism Failed, published by Yale University Press. It was picked up as one of the books of the year by Barack Obama, which did an enormous amount to popularize Deneen's argument. Deneen is also a professor at Notre Dame, but he's also one of those who spends a lot of time with the Orbanite emigre post-liberals in Hungary. Deneen writes, liberalism has failed, not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. It has failed because it has succeeded. As liberalism has become more fully itself, its inner logic has become more evident and its self-contradictions manifest. It has generated pathologies that are at once deformations of its claims, yet realizations of liberal ideology. Post-liberalism, as I'll go on to argue, offers itself as both an analysis of our current predicament, but also a fundamental challenge to what it takes to be the ambitions of liberalism. And one of the things I want to argue in the book is that the task of post-liberalism is to destroy liberalism as a political project, as a philosophical enterprise, and as a political movement. So I'm going to say something about where it came from, post-liberalism is, as I say, a movement. It uses familiar political ideas, but it brings them together in this fundamental critique of liberalism. What it means by liberalism, it leaves rather ambiguous, but my understanding is that it tries to see this as a catch-all for all viable liberalisms. If the objective is to annihilate and replace liberalism, then it can't simply be, even if it may be de facto, it can't simply be addressed to one particular version of a very complex tradition of inquiry in politics. The post-liberals think they are after everyone. Whether that works, we shall see. So my point in explaining post-liberalism is to draw out how that meta-critique works. The US is now the dominant site of post-liberalism as a movement, as an assault on liberalism. But it has its roots much earlier, and one can see it perhaps first in the immediate post-2008 financial crash, certainly in English political thought, Anglophone political thought. We've moved from the UK, where it was very marginal, but it was targeted through the likes of Maurice Glassman and his Blue Labour movement, or Philip Blond and his Red Toryism movement, as a critique of the compromises that both the political left, so the UK Labour Party, and the political right, the UK Conservative Party, had made with neoliberalism. 2008 was the collapse of neoliberal globalization, or the start of that. And these two sort of philosophical and theoretical movements appeared in the context of those political movements to reorient the thinking about policy and the agenda of politics away from globalization and neoliberalism. Whether that's quite what's going on in the US will be one implication. But the important point, I suppose, is that it is tied up with the rise of populist politics, which was unleashed after 2008. I mean, populism had been in various places on the rise, largely associated with globalization and neoliberalism. But with the collapse of neoliberalism as the basis of a progressive order, so the Third Way and various sort of European attempts to domesticate and turn neoliberalism towards broadly social democratic ends, with the collapse of that, post-liberalism unleashed a populist politics which has challenged the party dominance or the ideological dominance of the main political parties, certainly in the UK, but also across Europe. So the rise of populism is very much linked to this story. Yeah. So what I'm going to do in the next bit, and what I pay a lot of attention to in the book, is exploring what I call three faces of post-liberalism, right? And I take post-liberalism, or my analysis of post-liberalism, but I take post-liberalism to have a sort of Trinitarian structure. Now, in talking about a trinity, I'm both being rhetorical. One can contrast this three-faced story with, say, John Gray's famous Two Faces of Liberalism book, where Gray wants to both allude to the dishonesty of liberalism, saying one thing and actually meaning another, but also setting up two rival views. Right? One which is associated with the likes of Rawls and consensualist philosophical liberalism, and the other which is associated with the politics of what he calls modus vivendi, sort of like Hobbes. Why have I picked the Trinitarian conception? Well, most of the theorists of post-liberalism will get that connection because it's something that is deep in their understanding of the kind of communitarian thinking that underpins their critique of liberalism. So this is another version of the communitarian critique of liberalism, but it's one that comes from a very particular place. And that becomes very explicit in the third variant, common good absolutism. But it's also there amongst national populists. It's there in the turn towards common good communitarianism. So that's one reason for doing this, right? It's to theorize a version of communitarian politics and its critique of liberalism, and to see that communitarianism as having a certain kind of character, one that appeals to many who come at the critique of liberalism from a Christian commitment, right? And we'll see that, whether that's Catholics like Adrian Vermeulen, Patrick Deneen, Anglo-Catholics like John Milbank. Perhaps you could call him a Catholic fellow traveller like Maurice Glassman, who draws very much on some Catholic social teaching to make his argument. So they'd see that resonance. Why does that matter so much? Well, I think the important point to take out of Trinitarian theological thinking, one is that the three faces of the Trinity are both distinct, but they're integrated, and they exist in a dynamic tendency, in a dynamic tension and movement. And it's precisely that which the post-liberal thinkers build their communitarian position from. And it's why they think their communitarianism is a better fit for understanding politics than the sort of disconnected naturalistic communitarianism that some political philosophers tried to extract from the likes of Aristotle in the 20th century or Hegel in the late 20th century as a source for building a conception of our identities as communally constructed. This goes much more to the heart of the dynamism that takes place within that process of construction. But it also reflects on the way in which different post-liberals fit together these three different faces. So if you think of the British tradition, post-liberalism tends to mix national populism and common good communitarianism or conservatism. The US tends to focus on national populism and common good absolutism. So we'll see a kind of logical shift. So there's a dynamic element to the story. That's the point I'm making, right? UK, it's 1 and 2. US, it's 1 and 3. All right, let's look at each of those in turn. So I'm going to start with each one is going to get some pictures. So here we've got Christopher Lasch and Matthew Goodwin. Christopher Lasch, a cultural historian, died many years ago, but started on the left, but became an important critic in a series of books of what he saw as the development of liberalism towards neoliberalism. He wrote The Culture of Narcissism, True and Only Heaven, and The Revolt of the Elites. On his right, appropriately, is a British, no longer academic, more public commentator, Matthew Goodwin. Goodwin started out as a political scientist studying the rise of the new right, and wrote some respectable books on the National Front in Britain and the emergence of populist revolt against elites. He has two books that are significant for us, National Populism, and then his most polemic recent book, Values, Voice and Virtue. So out of these thinkers and those around them, the national populist strategy is to tell a story about liberalism, which is a kind of genealogy. It's a sort of unmasking of the story that liberalism tells about itself, and to tell us that actually it's really something else. Now, they wouldn't use that Foucauldian or Nietzschean language, but that's what they're doing. So they tell a story about liberalism, which is to expose it as a contributor to the desiccation of social relationships that is identified by people like Denis, right? The success of liberalism, the crisis of liberalism is its success. Why? Because it is to undermine social relationships. It's to create a world in which the pseudo values of social mobility and meritocracy are really a cover for the way in which neoliberal political economy creates a sense of person to fit the demands of its political ideology. So when liberals talk about liberating people from the local and small town world, what's really being done is creating a mobile workforce that fits a new political economic order. Right? It's nothing else than that. People like me may feel liberated from the small worlds we grew up in through higher education, but I'm only a cog in this machine that is producing a new kind of person that keeps neoliberalism going. Central to this is the primacy of meritocracy, the idea that there's a fit between individual effort and ability and social position. In the positive sense is if you work really hard at school, you'll get to a good university. And if you get to a good university, you'll either become a professor like me and replicate this corrupt social order, or you'll go off and make loads of money doing something else. Okay? It's to fit you to that super mobile view of the economy, which then creates winners and losers. So those who are not liberated become the left behind, and the left behind are losers in that global race. So for the populists, of course, that's what they're uncovering. The majority who are sort of thrown on the trash heap by globalization are the left behind. Those in small towns, deindustrialized cities, the foot soldiers of the populist response to an elite politics. So what the political scientists look at is the rise of populism, the breakdown of party hierarchy and association, identification, the weakness of political parties as a way of disciplining discourses, and the creation of opportunities for political entrepreneurs in good old Platonic style to manipulate that to their own interest, right? Read Plato's Republic, Book 8, his account of the weakness and failure of democracy. It's the rise of Trump, right? That's the story. So liberalism then is a disciplinary ideology, right? It's to make the elite feel comfortable in their eliteness. It's to replicate that order. It's to provide a mechanism for this. And because of its emphasis on social mobility and economic mobility, central elements of this liberal order for the national populists is their preoccupation with universities. So In the United Kingdom, we had the mass expansion of university education during Tony Blair's term, rising to close to 50% of 18-year-olds going on to some form of higher education, and of course, the significant expansion of inward immigration. So the two preoccupations of populists, the elitism of the universities, and the left that goes with it, the liberal left that goes with it, all the woke ideology that people like yourselves probably carry into that world, tolerant of difference, diversity, and so on, all that's just created in this strange space that is the university. And we're all in favor of immigration, which of course populists are not. So that's why those two things rise up the political agenda. The economic beneficiaries of both of those things are an elite, and that elite is really the one that's doing all the work. So that's Christopher Lash's view. That's more recently Matthew Goodwin's view. That's the view of populists and their preoccupation with universities and with immigration. What's the top issue that Trump is going to focus on when he comes into office? Getting rid of undocumented migrants, but also an assault on the universities, because it's the universities that sustain liberal discourse and its domination. It's from that that wokeness emerges. But national populism, as I say, it's a kind of genealogy of liberalism. It's an unmasking, but it doesn't give us anything to do other than to prioritize, being against migration, being hostile to the woke culture of universities and the way in which the humanities have been sort of colonized by critical race theorists and horrible French theorists of various kinds, all of the things we want to stamp out in the Anglophone world. And it's in that gap between the analysis and what is to be done that the second phase of post-liberalism arises. And this I've called, in the book, it's common good communitarianism, but it could be common good conservatism. And the people I'm focusing on here, John Milbank and Adrian Pabst. Milbank is a theologian, but he writes on political theory. There's a very famous book called Theology and Social Theory. He's an important figure in blue Labour, red Toryism in British politics, and he's a critic of sort of cosmopolitan liberalism and the university left. The other figure is Adrian Pabst. He's an academic and social commentator. He's written a lot on, he's written a couple of books, one of which is called Post-Liberalism. He's influenced by the thought of John Milbank, John Gray, who he was taught by at the LSE, and he was also taught by me. He listened to John Gray, not me. But he's an important figure in and beyond the academic world in terms of challenging the hegemony of liberal political philosophy. So taking up the genealogy offered by the national populists and then saying what this shows is the need for a return to a politics of the common good. So this is really a step away from particularly the versions of liberalism that play down the common good. So I'm going to be superficial in this, but it's to think about the ways in which political philosophy, liberal political philosophy in the hands of people like John Rawls, separate the right from the good. One of the slogans that goes with Rawlsian political theory, separating the right from the good and focusing on the primacy of the right over the politics of the good to create liberal principles and a liberal institutional order that manages difference and diversity, right? Somebody like Pabst in particular argues you can't do that, right? For the sorts of reasons that Michael Sandel argues in his early critique of rules, that if you think about the subject of rules is social contract, what you have is a sort of desiccated version of the self, a choosing subject that really has no content and therefore can't choose anything. If we're going to talk about individuals as bearers of rights, of having significance, we need a thicker concept which relies on institutions and structures. Perhaps the point there is that that means liberalism can't be foundational, it has to be parasitic on a conception of the common good. So the common good is not something that comes after the primacy of the right, it has to precede it. The good trumps the right, and it's within the context of the good that we make sense of concepts like the rights and duties, obligations, liberties, and so on. These are all secondary concepts, not primary ones. So this is an assault on what he thinks, what they both claim are the tendencies of liberalism towards the primacy of autonomy and the primacy of an autonomous subject as the central liberal idea of the person. In place of that, we have to draw out the fact that that identity and the possibility of autonomous choice presupposes situatedness, and that situatedness is provided by associative ties, faith, family, and flag, the institutions out of which our identities are constructed. Okay, faith, family, and flag is just a kind of motto, but it's a motto that resonates with populists who think that this should be the first thing we think about, not the cosmopolitan culture of human rights and our obligations to distant others. State, locality, faith, for many, as I say, there's a strong religious discourse going on here, but also the way in which forms of association that don't have to be religious confer identity on us, make us who we are, and create a sense of belonging. And this common good communitarianism, therefore, foregrounds these associative obligations and so on. And that's its advocacy of a shift in politics away from rights and to look at the institutions that maintain a sense of order, right, and grounds morality. Some of this is supported by helping themselves to Catholic social teaching, in particular Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, New Things from 1891, which foregrounds the importance of family, the dignity of labor against capitalism. So this could be a pathway to confronting the challenges of neoliberalism. And that's why some of these people see themselves on the left, but a different left. And their preoccupation is more to do with those fundamental associations that create our identity, sustain society, as opposed to the claims of individuals, which manifest themselves in the politics of autonomy, particularly arguments about expanding the rights and recognition of types of individual identity. Okay, so it fits nicely with that sort of communitarian left turn away from the new left's focus on gender, race, identity, accommodation, trans rights, all of those things, and instead looking at the basis of society, right? Liberalism gets worked up about families because, they might be exclusionary, and, families can also be horrible places as well as nice places. Whereas the communitarian common good theorists see it as the, an institute, a form of association that has its own intrinsic dignity out of which identity is created. Okay, common good communitarianism again gets us so far. It changes and explains the shape of the debate, but it has its problems. One way of seeing that problem is to think about the way in which liberal political theory has dealt with the problem of the common good. Right? Maybe a kind of desiccated Kantian autonomist version of liberalism is what's going on ultimately in Rawls. But another way of looking at it is that the politics of the right is a way of mediating the respective claims of these different conflicting conceptions of the good. Right? There's more than one. We all believe in the common good. We just have different views about what it involves. That's the challenge of liberalism. So the common good is plural and diverse. Well, that brings us to common good absolutism. And their fundamental argument is actually, no, it isn't, right? These people think of the common good with a very strong definite article. There is a common good. Politics of the common good involves the authoritative enforcement of that. So mischievously, my two representative figures here. One is Carl Schmitt. You know Carl Schmitt, generally not nice guy, Nazi, and Adrian Vermeulen. But my argument about bringing Schmitt into the story is not a kind of ad hominem to say, look, these people, they're obviously crazy because they're all taking their ideas from a Nazi. Schmitt, unfortunately, is one of the most important 20th century political philosophers. And it's what he's really thinking about that's central to the recovery of authoritarianism, and particularly amongst the US post-liberals, and I include Adrian Vermeulen here. So Adrian Vermeulen is a professor of administrative law at Harvard University. He taught at Chicago. He worked with Eric Posner, another very important American legal scholar, both of whom are influenced by Schmitt's legal thought, right? Particularly the idea of understanding the law as a concrete order, right? A concrete social order with its own internal logic and discipline and its own cult, lawyers. The point that Schmitt wants to emphasize, and they take up, of course, is that this asserts the pluralism of discrete legal orders. And why that matters in the United States is because it separates the United States as a municipal legal order from the obligations of cosmopolitan legal obligations. So much of what drew Vermeulen and Posner and others to Schmitt is precisely that recognition, okay? That there is no higher law than the law of this system. Anything else is actually elite politics. And once we understand that, we move away from, but comfortably, the obligations of international law and international legal institutions. And given the judgment of the ICC yesterday, we might see quite a lot of municipal legal systems suddenly discover that the obligations they have under the International Criminal Court or other such treaties suddenly become non-binding, not law. Well, that's one of the things that Vermeulen wants to draw from this. Vermeulen is also a fairly traditional Catholic, a convert, and as with many converts, he tends to be a bit disdainful of those who are always there, a bit lax and compromise with the world, and he wants a bit more sort of rigor in this. So what's the common good absolutist position? Partly it's to recover another idea that comes from Schmitt, which is the idea of political theology, right? One of the things that underpins each of these three traditions or faces is a sort of separate methodology or style. With post-liberalism, with national populism, we have genealogy. With the common good conservatives, we have philosophical anthropologies. With the common good absolutists, political theology as a post-liberal method. So what is political theology? Schmitt wants to explain a number of things. He writes a famous book, very short, very sort of pregnant and pithy, but not developed at great length, called Political Theology, which draws out a new approach to thinking about political ideas and political orders, right? So the first simple thing is that he sees analogies between many particularly concepts that attach to the idea of the state as being secularized theological concepts. He says that in terms in political theology, right? So there's an analogy between the way in which theological understanding fits legal and political understanding, right? He's mischievous in that he suggests, the idea of the church, the idea of sovereignty kind of reflects each other. And you see a bit of that, I suppose, in Hobbes's account of the Leviathan as a mortal god, right? So clearly that's an easy link, right? The sovereign is a mortal version of God, right? All powerful, and the state draws on that. The exception, which is so important to Schmitt, is like a miracle, okay? Kind of Walter Benjamin picks up on this too. The point about the exception is that it is outside of the normal structures of the Constitution. So there's no law that can cover it, because the question of the exception will always be, when do the laws cease to apply and who makes that decision? Just as in the case of a miracle, it's the suspension of the laws of nature. Stuff happens that shouldn't really be allowed to happen because of the laws of nature. That, to believers, is kind of the point of miracles, right? They're not supposed to be explained by the normal laws of nature. So that's one element. But perhaps more important, and I think this comes out in another book of his, Roman Catholicism and Political Form, from 1923, so a year later than Political Theology, is the way in which he explains how the greatness or spirit of Roman Catholicism is that it provides a total order. It provides a kind of analogy to a concrete social order. It fits that, the institutions and structures of it, bits of the state, the law, and so on. But it provides a total conception and understanding of it, right? Obviously, on the conservative right in Germany in the 1920s, this was still something that would have been held. But the thing that's important here is how it works, not whether it's true. So he's not, Schmitt is a kind of odd Catholic. He was brought up one, he sort of stays hovering around, but he's not in good standing with Catholicism throughout most of his life. So he's not saying this is a return to the integralist politics of Vatican I, although he might like it. What he's really doing is saying this is how political justification has to work. And here, I suppose, the easy analogy between political theologies and political theories is they start from that which they're trying to explain and justify. So the thing about a theology, unlike philosophy, think of Socrates. Socrates goes into the marketplace to challenge experts about their expertise. And at the end of all the lovely Socratic dialogues, we're none the wiser. And the point, I suppose, is that the philosophical quest continues, because Socrates says, well, I still don't know what courage is or what justice is or something, right? So the philosophical quest is open-ended, and it's that permanent quest. It's also the thing that's mocked by Nietzsche later on in the Gay Science, right? Because it's how Enlightenment undermines itself. Theology is different. It begins with a deposit of faith or truth. It starts with the truth that commands obedience, and therefore the theologizing is always rooted in that. The authority is, in a sense, given, and the task is really to articulate what that deposit of truth is. Now, of course, there will always be some theologians who lose their faith, Ludwig Feuerbach and so on. But generally speaking, it's an approach that has a purchase on those who are already committed to the activity of making sense of faith or the truth, which can't be undermined by that inquiry. So if you end up doing your theologizing and then you find you've got nothing left at the end, you've made a mistake. You haven't discovered a new fact that there's no such thing as God, or that the deposit is not true. So it's rooted in explicating this. Right, why does that matter? Well, it means that the fundamental political task now is not providing everybody with a reason. If you contrast theology and philosophy, philosophy is open-ended and perhaps critical and perhaps democratic. The task of popular sovereignty and democracy is to open up the quest for truth and the right way to rule. And that's kind of populist modernity. Crudely, that's kind of what Rousseau's social contract is about. That's what other liberal contractualisms and democratic theories are about. The best way of finding how to reconcile rival conceptions of the common good. If you start from the idea of political theology, your model is one of authority. You start with authority and the commands of authority. Now, you may want to explain them, but they're not affected by the process of rationalization or legitimation. Authority commands, and it's descending. We are given reasons, and those reasons are authoritative, whether we recognize them or not. So the big shift here, as it was for Schmidt, is away from the liberal culture of endless debate, deliberation, trying to accommodate pluralism and diversity. It's all in Schmidt's Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. Democratic deliberation is really just, well, one, it's a facade. It's not really what goes on at all. Actually, what you've got is powers working behind this. The press, class interest, working their way out. Deliberation is not part of the story, and therefore philosophical justification has much less place than the command of obedience. And if you start from the idea of truth and an authority, it doesn't much matter whether people disagree with you, right? The truth is the truth, whether people recognize it or not. The genius of Roman Catholicism and political form is precisely that. There is a truth, there is a single truth, there is a single conception of the common good, and it commands obedience. All right. Then the next step is to see how that brings us into the present. So there's a group of important common good absolutist political theorists. Vermeulen is one, Patrick Deneen is another, Gladen Papin, a number of others who are all what are called Catholic integralists. People who think that the truth commands obedience. Possibly this is the kind of ideology that underpins Viktor Orban. And one of the things that they're interested in now is the challenge of the liberal separation between the right and the good. Right? So under traditional Catholic teaching, the common good brings with it all the elements of the good, and which sees the supernatural ends of man as being the most important amongst all the proximate ends of man in that common good. So this is a sort of version of faith, family, and flag that puts faith first and foremost. And it's that which underpins morality, it's that which ultimately underpins law, and it's that which underpins the idea of natural law and the claims that natural law can make. If that's the case, it also has a concrete authority that determines all issues. That's the church. And the institutional structure of the church such as the Pope, right? Exercising power over faith and morals. But of course, the Catholic Church is a complex thing, and it's had to compromise with the modern world. And we see this most clearly, I suppose, in the 1960s with, it wasn't a teaching document that came out of Vatican II, but it was one of the important statements, Dignitatis Humanae, which recognizes for the first time the possibility of religious liberty and the possibility of freedom of conscience. Now, for many traditional Catholics, that's liberalism. Once you open up the possibility of freedom of conscience, in the domain of faith, you've got space for conscientious Calvinists to be allowed to have their space, right? Jews, all sorts of religious voices now have a certain kind of dignity because of this teaching, and the Church recognizes that alongside the truth of its own claims. And one of the authors of that doctrine was an American cardinal called John Courtney Murray. Murray was a very influential figure in Vatican II, and he'd been silenced earlier on in his career as an advocate of liberal compromise, particularly in the United States. He wrote a very famous book in the 1950s called We Hold These Truths, which is Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition. How can a Catholic, a proper Catholic, a confessional Catholic, be president of the United States? Why would that be a problem? Well, Al Smith in the 1920s had his presidential ambitions destroyed because of his Catholicism, and the argument was Catholics can't be presidents of the United States because, it's a fundamentally Protestant institution that separates church and state. Catholics can't make that legal separation, right? So Smith failed. John Kennedy in the 1960s, it was again an issue about his candidacy, and he was frequently asked questions, well, who will you be listening to, the voice of the people or the voice of the Pope? And the idea that Kennedy would take advice from the Pope was always laughable, but formally, that was the challenge. The teaching suggested that your fundamental obligation, your duty is to the higher power because your spiritual ends must trump your immediate secular ends in leading a good life. So the question then is, and this is the challenge for the integralist Catholics in the United States, is the United States a Protestant institution, or can it be integrated into the Catholic obligation? So the part of the debate is about whether or not the Church has become too liberal, and liberalism is the only game in town, and the task is to overthrow that. And what we need is a sort of resurgent, strong Catholic voice as a form, the primacy of the good over right and accommodation of pluralism. And then secondly, how does that leave us with respect to the Constitution? And that's where Deneen comes in, because that's his day job. So let me just sort of finish off with the debate between Deneen and Adrian Vermeulen. It's a lovely quote from a review of Deneen's book. At the stage of diagnosis, Deneen is masterful. At the stage of prescription, he relapses into liberalism, or more accurately, as I will explain, into liberalism's false image of itself. At the stage of diagnosis, Deneen proves beyond reasonable doubt that liberalism claims to eschew comprehensive substantive theories of the good, yet inevitably it enforces just such comprehensive substantive theory based on its particular and erroneous anthropology. At the stage of prescription, puzzlingly, Deneen tries to reissue any competing comprehensive theory and plumps for a vague communitarian localism, which can finally exist only at the sufferance of an aggressive liberal state. What we end up with then is an account of what is to be done. So Deneen, having written his first book, comes back to respond to Vermeulen with his second, which is called Regime Change. And one of the arguments there is that what we need is to overcome the hegemony of a liberal reading of the Constitution by replacing it with what he calls Machiavellian means to achieve Aristotelian aims. So the Constitution document and the separation of powers and all the things that go within it sits on top of a culture. That culture is liberal because liberalism has colonized it, but it doesn't have to be liberal, and therefore it has to be taken back from the liberals in order to interpret the Constitution in ways that doesn't violate the common good. And by that I mean Roe versus Wade, Obergefell versus Hodges, same-sex marriage, all the things that have animated a certain movement on the religious right in the United States against liberalism. For people like Vermeulen and Deneen, liberal constitutionalism is the relentless pursuit of religion to make it, to sort of purge it from the public realm. And therefore, Vermeulen's critique of Deneen is to say, to talk about retreating to the hills, what Deneen had called a Benedict option, rather like St. Benedict, salvaging Roman civilization from the barbarian hordes in the Dark Ages. We have to retreat to hold the line until we can come back. Vermeulen wants this to be a sort of, he wants to challenge the idea of separation that he thinks that conservative response replicates, which is precisely what liberals want. Separating the right from the good, privatizing religion, church, state. Separation is the liberal idea, and that's what the communitarian authoritarians want to challenge, and that's what Vermeulen thinks we need to do. So not retreat, but to take those institutions back. Deneen wants to do that through populist uprising. Trump, who he doesn't much like, but he's the best tool at our disposal, but also the steady march through institutions that replicate the political culture. Universities, to regulate them, to challenge the voice of liberal humanities, and so on. Compulsory military service, to build a kind of culture of commonality, to enforce the common good. Regimentation, a kind of liberal fascism, if you want another way of describing it. Vermeulen rejects all of that, and this is because he takes an idea of what he calls integration from within as the drive of post-liberal politics. Here the task is to build a new revolutionary hegemony. How do you do that? Think of Gramsci. You work through the institutions that sustain the current hegemony and you turn them to this new revolutionary direction. So what you need to do is to get places within the Constitution. Think of the Supreme Court of the United States. 5 of the 9 justices are all Catholics, right? Maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe that was a choice. Maybe that's how you overturn Roe versus Wade. They're all lawyers. They're all asked to adjudicate on cases. They're not asked, what are your religious views? But of course, you bring those ideas to your interpretation of the Constitution. And Vermeulen would say that's just what liberals did, right? They found a privacy clause that isn't stated in the Constitution, and from that privacy clause, we're able to articulate a right to abortion. There's no right to abortion in the US Constitution. There never was. There's no right to privacy. But if you can identify privacy, you can privatize women's procreative choices, health, and therefore out of that, you can create a legal right to abortion. That's what Roe versus Wade did. It was never legislated in the way that it was in the United Kingdom, where Parliament just passed a law decriminalizing abortion, right? In the US, there's no such law. Therefore, it can be adjudicated out. Now, is that appropriate or not? Well, Vermeulen's point is that's actually how legal institutions work. And he takes the ideas of somebody like Ronald Dworkin, an important liberal theorist, who sees continuity between the political, the ethical, and the legal, and challenges the sort of traditional liberal positivist separation between morality and the law. So for Dworkin, the interpretation of law involves principles as well as rules, and reading those rules in light of those principles, which in themselves also depends on what he calls the best account of our morality. So Dworkin provides all of that. Vermeulen just says, great, that's fine. The thing about the best account of our morality is it just happens to be the morality of the common good. It's not liberal egalitarianism as Dworkin thought it was. Now, we can challenge that, but Vermeulen's point is that's the stake. This is the game the liberals play, and anti-liberals can do the same. And that's how adjudication, how integration from within through colonizing the institutions of the state enables us to shift to a post-liberal order. The institutions stay the same, they just stop being liberal. And once upon a time, they weren't very liberal. That's his common good constitutionalism. They allowed slavery, for example, weren't very happy about women having rights, all sorts of things. The Constitution doesn't prescribe. It's not the articulation of a liberal order. It's the vehicle through which concrete order is achieved, and therefore it's always open to internal colonization. So just to finish off on that, even if Trump crashes and burns, the Vermeulen strategy allows for the transformation of society from within, the building of a new hegemony. That's what the post-liberals are after. Okay, I was going to say two things. I'll be very quick. So my critique of post-liberalism is really to tease out how far the post-liberals' account of liberalism works, right? To annihilate liberalism, it has to be something that defeats all liberalism. My argument is the tedious, boring liberal argument that Rawls was right all along, and that some version of political liberalism, or liberalism as a political doctrine, not as a conception of the good, provides a basis for an order that accommodates diversity and difference, whilst recognizing the claims of tradition, value, the good that make up complex democracies. And the principal benefit of that approach is that it accommodates diversity and difference without requiring us to say people are wrong. The liberal alternative is actually Ronald Dworkin's liberalism, right, which seeks to build liberalism as a rival kind of political theology, comprehensive doctrine that brings together constitutional interpretation, best story of morality, and legal adjudication in some complex whole. But it has the downside of having to show that people who don't buy the liberal argument are wrong. Political liberalism does not settle fundamental questions of the nature of man and society. It doesn't have to adjudicate on the fundamental nature of the person and so on. So it is sufficiently flexible and it creates conditional obligations which are also only there when others are prepared to accept reciprocally those conditional obligations. It leads to a kind of democratic order based on reciprocity. Of course, if reciprocity doesn't hold, then there's another conception of the political, that's Schmitt's, where it's a kind of confrontation. Post-liberals think that's the battle, right? Friend-enemy. It's a struggle between two incommensurable worldviews. One side has to win over the other. There's no middle position. Rawls tries to show us how we could have a middle position between strongly held different views about how to go on. Whether that's plausible or not, let's see, but that's the story. What it doesn't do, it doesn't assume that all liberals are committed to the primacy of autonomy as their core master value. Some are, some not. Some see autonomy, most importantly, as a purely political conception that underpins the idea of citizenship. It might be that as persons, we're not autonomous, we're constituted by our friends and families and nation and all the rest of it. But for the purposes of politics, to create the idea of a citizen as a distinct identity, autonomy comes into that. And that brings with it certain commitments like equality, which is completely absent from the discussion of post-liberalism. And one of the glaring consequences of the recent Trump election, of course, is that we see the world's second richest man after Vladimir Putin now central to Trump's administration, Elon Musk. Right? When you have those sorts of egregious inequalities of wealth and power, can you have a genuine democracy? The Rawlsian liberal view would say no. There has to be some cap on what can be the difference between the worst off and the best off. So that's the liberal challenge. I'm just 2 minutes to wind up because I know I looked at my watch and thought, I've got 5 minutes and now I'm 10 minutes over. So, but I'll let you finish. So I just wanted to try and draw this back to, is post-liberalism a conservatism? And I thought I'd just present you with two pictures, two of the big figures, particularly in Anglophone conservatism, Michael Oakeshott and Friedrich Hayek. I like them because they're both LSE people, all right? Hayek, of course, is obviously implicated in the ideology of neoliberalism. He's, his Constitution of Liberty was the book that Mrs. Thatcher got all of her ideas from. She didn't, but it's the story that's told. And he thinks of, the neoliberal order, which breaks down strong states and replaces them with markets, private, economic interest and so on, is the way forward. Why that has been co-opted by conservatives is a much longer story than I can give account here. But it goes with the hostility to welfare states, activist states, and progressivism. Right? And conservatives saw that as a concession to socialism. Once the argument is about socialism, then the challenge is creating the space for liberty, and by liberty he primarily means the liberty to distinguish yourself, accumulate, and so on. More interesting, I think, is actually Oakeshott. If I was ever a conservative, it would be an Oakeshottian conservative. Partly because Oakeshott's take on being a conservative is that it's not an ideology. To be conservative is to be disposed to think and behave in certain manners. It's to prefer certain kinds of conduct and certain conditions of human circumstances to others. It's to be disposed to make certain kinds of choices. And my design here is to construe this disposition as it appears in contemporary character, rather than to transpose it into an idiom of general principles. What Oakeshott is really interested in is overcoming the desire to provide a theory of conservatism as another candidate ideology. right? So it's more a kind of distancing ourselves from the tyranny of big theories and what he saw as the danger of people like myself and his colleagues, and the danger that he would have faced as having a significant chair in political theory, to be able to legislate, to set the agenda of ideas for future generations. That's not what conservatism is about. But that also starts to look a little bit liberal. You know, it's tolerating diversity and difference, okay? Not giving us a strong argument for the state. Caution. Now, if we see that as the liberal agenda, as the conservative agenda, and we can see some of that also in Roger Scruton, who also thinks that conservatism is a kind of liberalism. After Locke, it's about, you know, popular sovereignty and so on and so forth. Then, of course, our post-liberals are not conservatives. Instead, I think the best way to characterize them is as a challenge to conservatism to seek a reactionary alternative. Schmitt is a reactionary. He's unexplicit. He's you know, explicit about that. Vermeulen is a reactionary. These people are looking to return to an order and to create it actively. They're revolutionaries, and they place authority as if authority is unproblematic at the heart of their story. They don't buy into the complexity that the liberal order gives us in terms of liberal reason, justification, and being careful not to be too confident in our views. Oakeshott. No, there's a truth out there. It has a command on us. And the task of politics is to implement that. That strikes me as a revolutionary, a reactionary revolutionary, but a revolutionary doctrine, not a conservatism. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your indulgence. I hope I've left sufficient time to challenge.
We'll, oops. Stop sharing. Thank you very much. We're back. There we go. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation, helping us navigate the concept or movement that is post-liberalism. We now have time for discussion and debate, and welcome questions from the audience. Any burning questions from our student here or online? I certainly have a couple of questions, but if anybody wants to go first. Yes, if you want to perhaps introduce yourselves by giving your name and your institution.
And we've met in different circles.
Yes.
From CY.
No, Bentham.
Bentham, yes.
Sorry, your institution, CY University.
Yeah,
fine.
Yes. Thank you.
I have plenty of questions, and I thank you for a very clear account of things that we are seeing unfolding before our eyes. Perhaps I start with a very simple one, which is a contradiction that strikes me because the story you told is a story that unfolds in very high academic circles. And I was wondering, and there's a disconnection between this and the populist aspect of it. So I wanted to know if you wanted to comment on this, because I was surprised actually to see how it's not something I knew, because for me the figure of Trump, the figure of Orban is anti-intellectual, and you tell a different story. So that's and perhaps the second question to that is, at the LSE, which way do you see teachers and students moving?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that in France it's a bit different, and that's perhaps another question. But in France, the critique of liberalism is historically much more influenced by Marxism. So, which So I don't think we could write exactly the same story for France.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall I do?
Yes,
do
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, plenty to.
All very good questions. So, for the purposes of the story, the bit that is closest to actual populist politics is, of course, the national populism, right, strand. And you see some of those ideas, particularly the sort of critique of liberalism as an alien elite doctrine, does resonate in ordinary politics. It's people like us who are doing all the dangerous stuff. Why would you listen to people like us? So that's true. But the theory is not actually, that far from populist politics. I mean, I take your skepticism about Trump. I mean, Trump doesn't believe anything. Trump is just a narcissist, looking after his own. I mean, I don't mean that just to say horrible things about him, but he travels light. He doesn't have a theory. But there are people around him who do. And I think that's where these ideas converge. Vance may or may not be a paid-up post-liberal, but he certainly gives patronage to those who are. So his Hillbilly Elegy was taken up by the post-liberals. This is the story that Deneen is telling. Hey, Vance lived it. The desiccation of industrial American society, its contribution to the breakdown of family, and so on. It's a complex story because, of course, at the end of it, Vance kind of triumphs, and he's pretty hostile to his own family in that story as being partly responsible for their own failure. So it's a sort of tough response to the challenge of deindustrialization and the circumstances in which political frustration has arisen. But he brings some of these ideas close, okay? And then when you think about who the people he surrounds himself with, well, Deneen is a bit less Schmittian than Vermeulen, but Vermeulen's not, he doesn't hide it. He's not a Nazi. He just follows Schmidt's theory of a way of theorizing law and takes the fundamental vision of politics to be a challenge to the consensualism of liberalism. That's just an ideology, right? All right, I'll come back to the LSE. But your Marxists, Schmidt, Vermeulen, say, well, of course, they just have a different political ideology. I've talked about Roman Catholicism and political form because Schmidt was oriented that way. But the real challenge that he confronted was, of course, another version, and that was Marxism-Leninism, particularly Lenin's version of Marxism-Leninism, which was a totalizing doctrine. Seeing that, his real view is that needed to be confronted from the right with a similar doctrine. Liberalism would not do that. Liberalism would crumple because it doesn't have a theory of politics. Lenin has one, Marxists have one, and they're not liberals. Politics is not about consensus, it's about triumph. It's another kind of friend-enemy distinction. So, yes, the Marxists fall into this story, but they're a kind of post-liberal. They just have a different, if you like, political theology behind it. So, of course, they'll buy into that. But the end point then is struggle. So I suppose the liberals' hope is that there could be a space, a conception of the political that isn't one of these either-or friend-enemy struggles. The left, in the end, only has that. There's no way the left is going to persuade the right, the supporters of the right, to side with their agenda. And anyway, how would you even do that? All discourse is ideological. In the end, you confront your opponent and you understand where they came from, and they're created by the current order, and they have to be beaten. And there are different ways of doing that, but in the end, you defeat them in the way that the right has always defeated the left, or the left has always defeated, reactionaries. You fight them off the streets, and in the end, you kill them. So, what do the Marxists want? Well, when I have Marxist students, they're all kind of liberals, because they just think we could just have a discourse now that's really about structural power differentials. But Marxism isn't about that. Marxism gives us a politics of change. It's not a discursive politics of change. It's a struggle. Fortunately, there's history behind it. But Schmitt's point is, supposing there isn't history behind it. Supposing we're living in St. Augustine's secular order, the time of things rising and falling, just change. Hayek's view of history, right? One damn thing after another. In that context, it's just struggle with no guarantee who wins. So strike first. All right. We have Marxists, so I suppose that's the answer at LSE. There are alternative views and I suppose what's called the woke by the caricaturing of it by commentators, I suppose, is something that's also present, a sort of detached identity politics that privileges certain things over and above the actual politics of material interests. And I suppose one of the things that a resurgent liberalism will want to do, and perhaps this is what people are talking about when they say the Democrats have to reconnect with the working class or blue collar, is to have a kind of material politics that touches the interests of those who are just left cold or indifferent to a accommodation of diversity and difference.
Thank you. We have another question from Alan Gahan.
Alan Gahan, Université de Versailles-Saint-Quentin. Thank you very much for that. My current project is called Democratic Liberalism. You've given me lots to put into that. As you can imagine, I would have a whole lot to say, but I'll be brief and leave out most of it. So you set this up in a sort of Trinitarian format, and I'd like to know where the Holy Ghost is. So I'm a little curious why you chose to call this post-liberalism rather than simply populism.
Or illiberalism.
Or any of these possible choices. But in my case, I'd say, why you chose post-liberalism rather than populism. And another way to look at all three of these movements is that fundamentally, what they're actually opposing is not so much liberalism, which, as you well know, has many sides which they ignore. What they're really opposing is capitalism. And it's simply just the latest form of anti-capitalism when Marxism seems passé in many circles. And then entirely separate order of things here. I was delighted to see how much importance you give Christopher Lasch, who I think his importance is vastly overrated. Underrated, excuse me. But there's another figure whose world I think we're living in even more than Lasch's world. That's Michael Young. I think we're living the dystopia of meritocracy as he saw it. I might not see it that way, but I think we're very much in Michael Young's world. I'd like to comment on that. And last but not least, I've never been able to bring myself to seriously read Vermeulen and this sort of people, but you have. So I wonder to what extent there's a personalist element in their thought, because a lot of this could come out of Emmanuel Mounier. I'll stop there because I can go on forever.
No. You're on.
Thank you, Alan.
All right. So why do I call it post-liberalism? Well, partly because they all self-identify as post-liberals. And if you just start from that, you have a huge range that doesn't seem to otherwise cohere. Right? They're all post-liberal because they see liberalism as broken or the challenge or the danger. broken for the populists first and foremost, by which they mean the sort of public ideology of neoliberalism. And I suppose that's where Lasch comes in, and he says, well, I told you this was always going to be a revolt of the elites, because that's all this is about, right? This is the dynamic of late modernity or capitalism. So it's partly that. Are they anti-liberals? Yeah, they are. Sorry?
You say anti-liberals. I mean anti-liberals or anti-capitalists?
Well, I'm going to come on to the capitalism bit, but they're also, so they're all anti-liberals. But so I could have called this a kind of anatomy of anti-liberalism, but somebody else already wrote that book. And some of the characters appear in it. So Stephen Holmes, great, 25 years, nearly 30 years ago, has talked about this. But I think what's more than just theorists of anti-liberalism is that these are part of a movement who seek to do something about their anti-liberalism. And that's kind of where I ended up. So if you read Vermeule's review of Deneen's first book, Why Liberalism Fails, he's basically going, well, okay, so what? What do we do now? Retreat to the hills in our little Christian communities? No, there's another way here. Come clean. What do you think we should do? So Deneen goes off and writes his other book entitled Regime Change, which is the clue. So what we've got to do is to change the regime. He then equivocates, of course, about, well, who the regime is. Is it rebuild the institutional structure of American democracy? I think that is what they'll do. Or is it just get rid of an elite class and replace them with another elite? And maybe his sort of, Aristotelianism by Machiavellian means is precisely that. There's another elite, people like himself, those who've been to the various summer schools in Budapest, etc., and sat and learned all this stuff. But there's a lot of these people in the United States in good schools who will step up and do this. So we place the liberal elite with this other elite, and then they'll do the post-liberal bit because they'll judge, adjudicate cases against the grain of liberal precedents. They'll deploy, executive power through administrative law in ways that don't always match what we think of in terms of the separation of powers and so on. So all the crazy stuff Trump wants can be given a less crazy actual implementation. So I think post-liberalism is more than just the theorists of anti-liberalism. Because if I was just looking at that, I'd probably have done Alistair McIntyre, Carl Schmitt, maybe Leo Strauss, and one or two others, Chris Lasch. But there's more than that going on here, and I suppose I did worry maybe there wasn't until November the 5th, when it looks like there really is something going on here, and I think that will start to carry on developing. All right, capitalism. So yeah, all of these people are against modernity, right? They're all against modernity, and that's what they share with other, with Marxists and so on. What the post-liberals don't have is a theory of history. So where they differ from Hegelians, left Hegelians, right Hegelians, Marxists, is they don't have a theory of historical change. And I think this is something that, well, I think this is where the sort of, for want of a better word, the sort of Catholicism comes out strongest. So the theory of history that goes with this is very much, Augustine's account of secular time. Schmitt has that absolutely clearly. Okay, this is his worry about Lenin, that Lenin acts as if he's got history at his back, but actually he's just one more, rising power, offering us redemption through his political action. What in Christian terms would have been considered the Antichrist, someone offering to be that second coming, but it really, really isn't. And the trouble is, in secular time, you've got that all the time. So there's no narrative that gives us redemption. And indeed, there shouldn't be. So the task of politics is to prevent those who do offer it. So for these post-liberals, that narrative of redemption, that kind of antichrist moment, is actually the liberal one, liberal progressivism. And if you go back to early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century American progressivism, that kind of progressive gospel idea was very strong, where history becomes, the working out of human redemption in time. These people want to say no. And then if there's no historical change, there is the scope for, changeless values, because you're not progressing towards a utopia or a telos of the good. What you're doing is just saying, well, the truth is there. It's this. We don't need to accommodate to the present, because the present has no authority. The present always has to accommodate itself, and that is why the image of Catholicism is such a strong one for, the sort of political theology approach, because it offers its claim of itself is that it's an unchanging order. But that's also what Marxism does for Schmidt. So he talks about one, but he means lots of other things as possible candidates. Liberalism isn't going to be one of those, because it doesn't have a core. It can't be a concrete order, and therefore there's nothing to struggle against. Or if it is, it's a dishonest one that is doing something other than what it says. And that's where it is, in Marxist terms, the capitalist order, genuinely capitalist order. And he's as hostile to that and the over mighty claims of German capitalists as he is of the left. Trouble with capitalists is they read Marx and think, yeah, we are those people, right? Hayek's a bit like that. It's Marx's account of the capitalist mode of production, but without redemptive history. Lots of other Austrian thinkers are like that. So that's the issue about modernity. Meritocracy in Young, yes. I mean, meritocracy is such a big thing for the post-liberals, precisely because they do read Young and they say, look, this is a dystopia. This is not, the model for society. If you read that book, this is not good. This is about institutionalizing inequality. And that's all that liberalism really does. It offers liberation to people like myself coming from ordinary backgrounds. But actually all I've done is bought myself into a new elite culture, which I'm replicating and my children will bear in the future. It's not really the rise of social mobility or, ensuring equality of opportunity and talent. It's building an elite, which then exercises domination. Mounier, yeah, perhaps draws on Mounier a bit. I mean, it's kind of only thrown in there. Henri de Lubac is also very much here. These are Trinitarian communitarians. And I think there's a frustration amongst, the religious thinkers here that communitarianism has been co-opted as a naturalistic philosophy, right? On the trivial grounds that, well, we're all born into, a home, a family, a place, we have a natural language, all these things make us who we are. But communitarianism isn't that. Communitarianism isn't just the fact of social embeddedness. It's about the way in which community works. And that's where this sort of theological element comes in. because it's supposed to challenge the individualistic direction of, change. It's supposed to give us a way of making sense of change, in the secular order, in a world where history is done somewhere else. That's kind of Augustine's story. Redemption is done kind of off the stage, and the danger is trying to see God's plan, providence, and so on working its way out in the United States or late Roman Empire or something. History doesn't do the work of redemption. That was done and is done beyond time. So those who tell us that history is this place, are dangerous. And then the other bit is to how to make sense of the common good in relation to that when it's not a teleological story as it would be for Aristotle, or as Hegel tries to make it with his theory of history, where he tries to, in a very grand way, naturalize, Christian redemption without that then being just theological. So this is against Hegel. All right, there's a lot there, and be interested to hear more offline if you want to comment. Sorry.
I can't see any virtual hands online. So, yes, we do.
Yes.
And yes.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So
thank you.
Your institution, I've said it at the beginning. You want
yes, I am from the Université de Bourgogne in Dijon. And thank you very much for this fascinating paper. I was intrigued by your mention of Glassman's Blue Labour and Philippe Blanc's Red Tourism at the beginning of your talk. And I would be very interested in knowing your diagnosis of the failure of these ideological experiments, and in particular, Glassman's failure, Blue Labour's failure to challenge the rise of, national populism among Labour voters in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. So I know it's not exactly political theory, but I was just wondering if you had any views about this.
That's a great question and challenge, and I do have views about this. So I think it's actually more important than maybe the sort of theoretical working out of the post-liberal challenge is, because it's much closer to the ground of politics. So, Glassman starts his critique of it's Blairism, it's the third way, and that's where his argument for Blue Labour as a post-liberalism emerges. And I remember, having conversations and debates with Morris at LSE in, 2010 after Gordon Brown's loss, and the coalition government came in, and the future of Labour was discussed. And what Glassman wanted to do was to move towards a more class-focused Labour, building on its history. So he tells a story about its history as one of being this kind of associationalist politics, emphasizing trade unions, situated class politics in industrial cities, and so on. And he tells a story about this is the world he grew up in, and he learned all this from his mum, and building Labour history and so on. He's associated with a number of figures. John Cruddas is another Labour figure, was MP for Barking. Dagenham, sorry. And Dagenham was the constituency in which Europe's largest Ford works was based, okay? Building cars for the British and the European market. And it's kind of disappeared. And in its place, you had an upsurge. So the skilled blue-collar working class left. In its place, you had an influx of immigrants, the poor housed in large council estates, and you had the rise of the hard right, the National Front, and then the British National Party. And there's a big story about the fight against them, the physical fight as well as the institutional fight, as they had started to establish electoral roots in that constituency. Okay, Dagenham is also kind of important to me because in the mid-1950s, my father came to England to work at Dagenham. He worked in Ireland at Volkswagen. They shut, globalization then. He went to England to get a job at Dagenham. I could have been part of that world. He got a job somewhere else and we ended up in a small town in the south of England. But that sort of cultural history of labourism is very important to figures like Cruddas, who had been close to Tony Blair, but then became a kind of a challenger to this compromise between social democracy and globalization. Globalization is the only game in town. The task of a left politics is to redistribute the benefits of it and therefore to manage it a little bit better than otherwise. All right. So Glassman is in that world. What happens by the time of Brexit? Of course, Glassman becomes more and more populist. And when the Brexit debates came up, he was very much on the side of leaving. He was part of a group that was called Lexit, which was Labour Brexiteers. Now, the rationale for that would have been something like, being in the European Union prevented us from having a kind of economic nationalist socialism in one country policy. So, putting up tariffs, industrial policy, saving, these areas and industries from closure and so on and so forth. Didn't work terribly well in the 1970s, but that's the kind of strategy that Glassman supported and therefore was hostile to, the open market free movement and of course immigration, free movement of labor that goes with that. So he's kind of made his peace with populism. Has this had any bearing on Labour politics since? Well, the architect of Keir Starmer's victory, a guy called Morgan McSweeney, another emigre Irishman who came to England, became a Labour activist, worked with Cruddas in the battle of, Barking and Dagenham, fighting the right. He was the campaign coordinator and the person who built Labour's campaign against the Conservatives and the right, and he's a central figure. How far that has an impact on the policy agenda is very hard to tell. But I suspect for all of his, for all of the noise that we hear about Starmer, he's much more left than people realise. And he's left in that more focused view on distributional politics, industrial strategy, investment in ordinary people. The fights he's picking, which get a lot of press, are against the farmers are being taxed by inheritance tax. He's fighting landowners. He's fighting landed power. He's fighting invested wealth. But he's not doing it in the way that Corbyn would have done. As I'm the vanguard of the people, leading the triumph of the workers against. It's much more subtle, but I actually think it's actually more focused on, a politics of blue collar, ordinary people. And I think that's a lot to do with McSweeney. So, we'll see whether it works. We'll see whether there's betrayal. We'll see all of these things. But I think that's where the Glassman legacy is still doing something. Glassman himself is now a bit of a kind of contrarian. He goes on the news and says, we should all make peace with Trump. Trump's great. This is a great opportunity. No one believes all that rubbish. But the real impact, I think, is the shifting of certainly the social democratic voice in British politics away from high liberalism and rights to this idea of redistribution and class.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
if I might maybe squeeze in a question at this point. You set the roots of the current discontent in the global financial crisis, 2008, and certainly a reordering began then. No banker went to jail. Certainly the turning point was when Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, former Goldman Sachs CEO, got down on one knee pleading Congress to bail out banks and using taxpayers' funds to buy toxic assets from failing banks. So after such an extraordinary event, something had to give, Brexit, and then Trump won. In retrospect, do you think this was the only event which gave rise to the current rejection of liberalism, populism, or whatever we call it in its current form? Or were there others? Or would post-liberalism have happened in any event?
Whether post-liberalism would be where it is now without some version of 2008, I doubt. I mean, it's very much a movement of a moment, although that's quite a long moment. 2008 was quite a long time ago. And that's still resonating deeply in the United States. I think US politics is, particularly the politics of the Democrat Party, is still reeling under the disappointment that many felt about Barack Obama. I think, to be fair to poor old Barack Obama, came in with a huge amount of enthusiasm to change, and then was saddled with the banking crisis. I think, faced with a global financial crash, I'm not sure what the alternative was other than to bail out the banks. Did it have to be done in a way that nobody was then held to account? Well, then you get into the complexities of US politics. The very same people that Paulson had to get down on one knee to were not keen on pursuing a tough regulatory strategy against Wall Street. So Obama's kind of left with, you came in to change everything. What did you do? You bailed out capitalism. What was that all about? And I think there's some of that legacy still. He has a very, he's a hugely talented political figure, but he has a very toxic reputation. And I think that's not wholly of his own fault. Biden, had done quite a lot to change the economic order, but 4-year term, old man, he's not going to benefit from any of that. So we're then looking at what's the future. The trouble is, it's always an act in the US. There is never, because of the place of money, you will never get a working class party. There's no world in which a blue-collar figure is going to come to dominate American politics without being bankrolled by wealth. But I think that's also perhaps the risk that Trump faces, because for all of the things that he's going to offer for the populist agenda, it's going to be more neoliberalism, as it was last time. It was massive tax cuts. Wall Street sees its opportunity and it will take it. And I think that's also true of the Silicon Valley. They're not there to see, the re-empowerment of blue-collar populism. They're not. They're there to see the same old people protect themselves. So that means I doubt we'll have, the world will change under Trump. I think it's going to be.
Your conclusion was quite a powerful one. Nothing less than a revolution awaits us. Are we talking heads on pikes or guillotines, as we say here?
Well, I think you then turn to what is it the post-liberals are really after. And if you look at people like Vermeulen and so on, and the common good constitutionalism, they're really after, the institutionalization of a progressive morality, and the rights of identity and persons and so on. That's what they're really interested in. They're not actually interested in redistributing wealth, in challenging. One of them is, there's a figure called Sohrab Ahmari, who is part of this Catholic integralist group. But Ahmari is one who sees, he wears his sort of Catholic social teaching on his sleeve and said, this is the challenge to the libertarian constitutionalism of the current Supreme Court, which is all in favor of capital over labor. And what we need is that kind of balance. And how you get that balance is empowering labor unions to balance out, the interests of capital. It's Lasch. That's exactly Lasch's diagnosis. Once you get rid of organized labor through the circumstances in which it's necessary by capitalist modernity moving on, or by tying its hands, you end up with capitalism, with capital running riot. Not because they're bad, but just because that's the dynamism of capitalist modernity. If there's no equal and opposite challenging capital, it will just do what it does, and that's what we see happening. So his view is that actually you need to move, to block that, to challenge that. I doubt that will come out of a Trump administration. Empowering labor unions, I suspect, don't know, nobody really knows what's going on in Elon Musk's mind, but I suspect that's what a lot of the Silicon Valley interest siding with Trump is concerned with. Labor empowerment and trust busting. That's what they don't want. Not sure they want tariffs. Musk sells lots of cars in China. Let's see how this works out. I think it's a marriage made in hell, not heaven. But the thing that they get is this, this walking away from what Biden didn't do, but possibly had there been a two-term, you'd have seen more of, breakup of big social media empires and some relaxation on the restrictions of organized labor.
Thank you very much. I think everybody agrees here, we could carry on listening to you for much longer, but I'm afraid it's time. We've used up our time, so we would like to thank warmly Professor Kelly for sharing his thoughts on liberalism, post-liberalism, the new conservatism in the context of the current messy reality of contemporary politics. Our next seminar is scheduled to take place on 13 December, and our guest speaker will be Stéphane Revilliers from the University of Bourgogne. His presentation is entitled Rishi Sunak's Brand of Conservatism During PMQs. Until then, hope to see you all here or online. Until then, it's goodbye from us all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your time.